just start by saying I Skype my mum regularly, and Skyping her yesterday. I always have to remind my mum when she's Skyping me not to go like this, otherwise I can only really see up her nose or in her ear. But if I could just start by recognising the traditional owners of the land there where you are and where I am here. And also thank you for having me via Skype. I think it's an important tool that we can use more. It's not as perfect as being there in person, but it helps me get to my son's school event tonight and balance work-life balance as well. So, look, it's a pleasure to be here. And John had to follow. I must say I was taking quite a few notes there on what I could, on his tips, his 10 commandments. But really, actually, what I wanted to do is share with you some perspectives that I have. One, as a public servant of 25 years. Two, as somebody who's spent a lot of time outside of government. I've run a non-government organisation, a registered charity, and so I know what it's like to lobby government and be outside trying to influence government. That's something where I learned a lot and achieved quite a lot. Particularly getting the Australian government's rollout of unsniffable fuel in the central deserts to protect young Aboriginal kids from sniffing. But also on a day-to-day level, I work with Minister Josh Frydenberg, and I still have a lot to do with Minister Greg Hunt, who appointed me as Australia's first Commissioner back in 2014. And also just last week I was with New Zealand's Minister Maggie Barry launching their threatened species strategy. So I spend a lot of time with different ministers at state levels and also mayors, I should say. Remember the politicians, every mayor is a politician as well. And finally, I think from my experience as the Threatened Species Commissioner, I've learned a lot about how people try to lobby and influence me. So my key take-home message is probably that the techniques or the tools or the communication styles that you're going to use to influence politicians and policymakers are actually the same as the tools that we should use to engage with citizens. And I think that's because in Australia and other democracies, politicians have to apply for their jobs every 3 years. And so from my experience in Canberra, working as a senior public servant, but also spending a lot of time in the field and having a job that has a degree of sort of political elements to it as a Threatened Species Commissioner, I think that is the most important. And particularly across the world with mature democracies at the moment where there's a growing sense of citizen disenfranchisement and increased competition for views through tools like Facebook and social media, where people can get their views across and government has to compete more to get its message out. And so that's my main tip. Look, I'm really proud of actually how I do that, I should say. I think it's the most, the part of my job that I enjoy the most is actually engaging with and influencing the community. Hopefully many of you have already heard me say that the biggest threat to our wildlife is the Kardashians. And that's because Kim Kardashian has 76 million people following her on Facebook and Twitter, and more Australians are interested in the Kardashians than numbats, quokkas, quolls, or the endangered animals that I'm trying to save. So growing awareness, growing our inherent and intuitive love for our animals and plants that really define us, and getting Australians to demand, not just from government, but from all of us as citizens and from the private sector, greater commitment to saving species. The single biggest thing we can do, I think, is actually compete with Kim Kardashian. And so, look, yeah, I've got 9 tips. And so my first tip is actually about language and image projection. And today I'm speaking to you in a suit, but actually I try to spend most of my time actually in jeans and within a Cooper hat. And if I'm actually out in the community, I try not to project the image of being like what some people refer to as a suit. And that's because we need to convince Australians that saving species and investing in natural resource management, that investing in the 50-odd NRMs like Port Phillip Catchment Management Authority that's hosting this event actually is so important. Language can make a huge difference, as can image projection. And actually, if you have a look at a Facebook post I did last night, the latest Facebook post on the Commissioner's account, I think you'll see the language I use. I try to use language that resonates with my aunties in Ballina and my cousins in Wagga Wagga and Dubbo. Because that language, actually, John, as a former Premier, he understands it. My Minister understands it. The scientists understand it. But so do the voters, so do the citizens of Australia. So I think language is really important. My second point is that it's really important to tune into politics. And that doesn't mean being political. Indeed, my recommendation to organisations seeking support from governments is to be as apolitical as you can, particularly given that governments come and go, but some of the overarching objectives don't. And I think, for example, on issues like feral cats, for example, I've spent a lot of time tuning into the politics on feral cats, and actually tackling feral cats is good politics. I have everybody from Jackie Lambie and the Sporting Shooters Association, the New South Wales Farmers Federation and Murrumbidgee Irrigation and the Hobart Cat Society forwarding and sharing and liking my Facebook posts, as well as the Australian Conservation Foundation and WWF, and from time to time Christine Milne and people from the Greens. So, but actually I think it's so important in terms of that tuning into politics to be aware that where you can make something apolitical or where it's supported by the broadest spectrum, political spectrum as possible, it's going to have a lot more traction. So that's one reason why I go hard on feral cats. But for example, John was talking about feral herbivores in the high country. And actually feral horses, which are also called brumbies, are a huge threat. They're one of the top 3 to 4 threats to Kosciuszko National Park. And when Banjo Patterson wrote his poem, there are about 500 brumbies in Kosciuszko. And my grandfather fought in World War II, and I had his hat as his oldest grandson. And I understand the cultural significance of brumbies, but they are a significant threat. And Banjo Patterson would roll in his grave if he knew how many feral horses were in Kosciuszko now and the damage they're doing. But that said, that is a much more political sensitive issue than feral cats, so I need to be more careful communicating and engaging with government on that issue and not cornering my minister or other ministers on that. One of the tools that I use comes to my third point, which I call the Al Gore First Principles. And I was lucky enough about 5 or 6 years ago to spend 3 days with Al Gore in Chicago in his Climate Reality Leadership program. And what I learned from Al Gore was to pitch to first principle arguments, pitch to arguments that everybody on that spectrum that I was talking about before, whether you're from the Hobart Cat Society or whether you're the ACF, whether you're Murrumbidgee Irrigation or whether you're the Jumble Aboriginal Corporation in the Gibson Desert. These arguments that resonate with all of us. And Al Gore, for example, when he's trying to get more support and traction for climate action in the US, talks a lot about the threat to skiing, people who love skiing, because skiing isn't a fringe activity of just the left or just the right. Everybody likes skiing. So by tapping into that concept and the threat of climate change to skiing as something that Americans love, he can bring in more people. Similarly, the California Condor Recovery Team has done a fantastic job in the US at reducing the single biggest threat to the condors, which is actually consuming lead pellet or lead shot from the hunting industry. But in doing that, it hasn't called for an end to hunting. It's actually tapped in to the fact that Americans, and a lot of Americans, actually like hunting. And it's actually shown and argued that lead shot is a threat to hunting because lead shot poisons the ground and poisons the animals that hunters want to shoot and eat. So finding these first principles, and if you look at the communication that I use, in terms of engaging Australia on saving species, I use our love for our wildlife. The fact that 90% of our animals and plants are found nowhere else on Earth. The fact that we put a kangaroo on the tail of Qantas, but then reminding Australia that we've already lost 8 macropods to extinction and 16 more are at risk. So nobody can argue with the fact that here in Australia we define ourselves through our animals and plants. So I actually never apologise for saying our wildlife's cute, or for emphasising that saving species is something we're doing for ourselves, because when we lose our species, we lose a part of what it means to be Australian. You don't usually hear me talking about Australia's international treaty obligations as a reason why we need to save the marla hare wallaby, or you don't usually hear me talking about the need, the scientific need to save cave-dwelling invertebrates because of their ecosystem service role. Because if I start talking about that, I'm not going to be pitching to the widest spectrum as possible. And this comes back to this point that politicians have to apply for their jobs every 3 years. So politicians have a much greater need than, say, a public servant like me to be tuning in to what mainstream Australians think. John made a few points about knowing what the government's agenda is and coming with solutions, not problems. I call that being realistic and actually matching your ask to what the government can offer. So rather than, for example, I noticed in the 2013 election, 2014, 2013, when the Abbott government came into power at the federal level, a lot of people were cranky and were arguing about cuts in funding the NRM sector. But some organisations like Terrain NRM in Far North Queensland, they found these new tools like the Green Army, and they worked out how they could match the Green Army up with their existing programs and other activities, and they're doing a fantastic job now saving one of Australia's most endangered gliders, the mahogany glider, and that's in partnership with the local Indigenous rangers, local farmers, and drawing on the programs that were available rather than complaining about the programs that weren't available. So that brings me to my 5th point, which is wherever possible, be what I call non-shaming or non-blaming. As an Aboriginal person, something that I'm sensitive to is the concept of shaming, which is where you publicly put someone down. And actually, you know, if you look at social media and you look at politics, you think, oh, that's an acceptable behaviour. But all of us as humans, none of us like being shamed. And from my own personal perspective, if somebody comes to me and abuses me for not supporting them, and someone else comes and asks me how I can help them, and are there resources that I can find, I'm going to resonate and I'm going to listen to more the person that's not shaming me and not blaming me. I think that also transcends though into the intellectual arguments, and I mentioned before about international treaty obligations. I think if I'm a conservation organisation and I want the Australian government or the Victorian government or my local council to be doing more for conservation, I think what will resonate the least is lecturing about our international treaty obligations or moral arguments about why the government needs to act. Actually inspiring and inviting governments and leaders, individuals and politicians, inviting them to be leaders and heroes in the fight against extinction rather than blaming them for not doing things can be a much more powerful tool. And I try to do that every day with cat owners, because I have a target to cull 2 million feral cats by 2020 to protect our wildlife, because we've already lost 22 mammals to extinction and another 124 species are at risk. And a lot of domestic cat owners are concerned and worried. And what I say to them is you can be a hero in the fight against extinction and you can play your part by choosing to be a responsible pet owner. So rather than criticising them for not keeping their cat indoors, I turn it around and make it positive. Look, they're the main points. I think one other that I talk about a lot, and I mentioned at the beginning, was competing with the Kardashians. And I think we've got to do a lot better. The conservation industry can do a lot better The fact that most Australians recognise Kim Kardashian and Justin Bieber, but few, if any, Australians can name the 12 mammals rarer than China's giant panda, that's actually not Australians' fault. I think that's the conservation community's fault for not getting Australians interested in and not communicating in a way that Australians and our politicians can resonate with. So the power of social media to encourage social diffusion and to communicate messages is really immensely important. And actually, just as an example, on foxes, there's an organisation in Sydney called the Sydney Fox Rescue, and they rescue and try to release foxes. And actually, they have 16,000 people following them on Facebook and people donating to them. And actually, I could have ignored that, but I actually challenged that respectfully and in a non-shaming way on my Facebook account and explained why it's inhumane for foxes and the 100 Australian species at risk from foxes. And I reached 265,000 people with that message. So we can compete with the Kardashians by getting out and using tools like social media. By me being here today competing with the Kardashians, for example. But we can also compete with the Kardashians by translating that into practical and real communication on the ground. And I try to spend as much of my time as I can in rice paddies in the Riverina or in remote Indigenous communities out in the field, engaging with real people on real issues in a really authentic way. Look, just finally, I think another important thing is actually showing that we're not wasting public money. Funding is always limited, and we have to be accountable for public money. And so, for example, I always choose to hire a Hyundai Getz. If I hire a car, I get the smallest possible car I can. I choose not to fly business class even if I'm entitled to it. And I'm really proud of the fact that the costs of running my office are less than 3% of the funding that we've mobilised over the last 3 years. Since my appointment in 2014, the Australian government's mobilised $211 million for projects supporting species, and over 1,000 projects are occurring across Australia as a result of this new model, and multiple species are going up. But the cost of this model and the cost of running my office is less than 3% of that. And that compares to 15%, which is the administration and advertising costs of World Vision. So actually, in a small way, me using, although my main reason was actually to be at my information night for my son for his high school tonight, by not being there in person, I'm also saving money that we can plough in fighting extinction. So demonstrating that accountability and non-waste, I think, is really important. My last 2 points are, well, actually, my second last one, relationships. I think John really summarised this quite well, so I won't get into it, except to say that what I learned in China is that, as a diplomat in China for 4 years, the people who you disagree with, you need to have an even better relationship with them than the people who you agree with. But what I often see in the conservation game, and perhaps this was a luxury because I came into it as a non-conservation scientist, I was a diplomat for most of my career, but what I often see is that conflict or disagreement on policy approaches quickly unravels into personal conflict. Well, that just damages relationships. And the people who disagree with me, for example, the people that want to trap, neuter and release 2 million feral cats rather than, the approach that we have, which is to humanely dispatch them with a gun or with baiting or indigenous hunting or whatever is most appropriate. Those people that disagree and want to trap, neuter and release 2 million feral cats, I want to have a better relationship with them than the people who support me, because they're the minds that I want to change. And so that's the same when you're engaging with politicians or senior public servants like me. Maintaining that relationship, from my perspective, over 25 years, mostly as a diplomat and working in Indigenous affairs, is really, really important. In my last job, I was the Deputy Head of Australia's delegation to the UN climate negotiations, and I had to front up as the lead for climate finance and as the lead for what the UN calls loss and damage. and tell developing countries, small island states in the Pacific, that Australia won't support compensation for them in the event that they're eventually inundated. Now, actually, that was a pretty tough job, but I can tell you, actually, spending the time to have respectful and kind relations with those people was really important. I wouldn't have been able to do that job if we couldn't have all been personable together. So, look, my last point is actually to make it fun and keep it authentic. And I was just thinking, what engages me? Well, in 2 weeks, I'm going to actually fly out to Alice Springs, and then I'm going to drive for 8 hours into the desert and sleep in a swag for 5 nights, hunting feral cats and trapping and monitoring endangered rock wallabies. And why am I doing that? I'm doing that because the Unamul Pitjantjatjara Yunupinjara Rangers in South Australia made a YouTube video inviting me and put it on YouTube. And basically, old ladies, kids, old men, everyone over 2 minutes were all saying, "Hello, Gregory Andrews. We want you to come and see what we're doing to save Australian species. Come out and visit us and see what we're doing to tackle feral cats and save the rock wallaby." It was a beautiful video, and there was no way I could say, "No, I don't want to come." So look, I love camping and I love lying in the swag at night looking at the stars, and I get a lot of satisfaction tackling the threats to save our species. But the thing that made that happen was a bit of initiative from them, making it fun, and actually enticing me, and also perhaps competing with the Kardashians. That they were using modern technology. They used they put it on YouTube and Facebooked it and all of those sort of things. So there we go. They're my key points. Thank you again for having me, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion now as well.